All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Thank you for tuning into the stream today, whether you are watching me live or if you are watching this back as a recording. I appreciate you being here. If this is your first time watching the show, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from our users about DFS, about SaberSim, about sports betting. We talk a little bit of strategy on a slate-to-slate basis sometimes. We've been talking a little bit of DFS theory lately. We do some product demos, really whatever you guys want to talk about, whatever is helpful to help you guys use SaberSim to build better lineups in DFS. That's perfect. That's what we talk about. We get our questions in here through our Office Hours channel in Slack. We get questions in through YouTube chat, and we get questions in through email, support@sabersim.com. So whatever is easiest for you guys, those three avenues are the best place to go. I highly recommend, if you are not already in our Slack community, joining up. We've got an awesome group in there. There's great discussion every day. At the conclusion of office hours every day, there's a lot of sometimes back and forth and follow-up discussion between different people in the community. So I highly recommend getting joined up if you aren't in there already. Every office hour video on our YouTube channel has in the description has a link to join our Slack community. So at the end of this afternoon, when I get this recording up, it will have a link to join the Slack community in the description. But every single other office hours video I've already put out has one. If you want to join up, you are welcome. We'd love to have you. You can also always email us. I mentioned that, support@sabersim.com. Ask us any questions you have. If you'd like for me to answer that on stream, just mention it in your email. Otherwise, I'm always picking out some of my favorites that come up in our email inbox and talking about them here live. So please, we are doing this live for a reason. So I want follow-up questions. I want there to be a dialogue here. I want there to be a little back and forth. So if you have any questions, always feel free to shout them out, right? Let's see. On Thursdays, we're using this exact time slot instead of office hours every week to host what we're calling a strategy session, where we do a deep dive into a DFS concept or sport or contest type or whatever, anything that has been popular in office hours recently. So last week I was on here with Matt and Will. They were talking a little bit about our baseball model and some of the improvements we've made this season and the results we're seeing. So that video is up on YouTube. We have gotten some awesome positive feedback about that video. I highly recommend going and checking out if you haven't already and you are playing MLB DFS or doing baseball sports betting this season. This week, I'm going to have Max back on the show. We're going to be talking about building lineups for MLB DFS and different strategies you can use to build successful lineups, whether you want to leverage taking advantage of editing projections or ownership or exposures, right? SaberSim offers you a lot of different tools to build effective lineups. We've mentioned before, you don't have to use all of them. You can use some of them, or you can do a little bit of editing projections and a little bit of editing exposures. We're going to have Max on and talking a little bit more about just different strategies you can use to build effective MLB lineups and to add value to the SaberSim process, right? I think everybody has their own certain flavor on what really makes sense to them intuitively, whether it's editing projections or really dialing in exposures or tweaking ownership fade. And we've talked a bunch about this stuff on and off in office hours so far as we've gotten into baseball season. So we want to kind of bring all that together, do more of a deep dive into, lineup building strategy when using SaberSim for baseball. So that is going to be our topic this week. And we'll be back again next week with some more baseball content. So anyway, I've got a handful of questions in my queue this morning here. I see some of this stuff is some follow-up from yesterday's conversation. So as I get to questions that I think are kind of resting on or following up on a conversation we had yesterday, I'll call it out here. So if you missed yesterday's, you know where to go in that recording, and you can find the timestamp and get caught up there. But I'm going to go ahead and just start jumping in and getting at some of these questions. Again, as always, if you've got something you want me to talk about, doesn't even have to be a fully fleshed out question. If you just got a topic, maybe something you're kind of confused on, whatever, pop it into Office Hours channel in Slack or pop it into YouTube chat. We'll get right to it. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started here. Okay, cool. So Jacko asked yesterday evening here, he mentioned, first of all, that he wanted a Thursday strategy session focused on esports. I linked that esports strategy session in the channel there. We do have that if you've been playing League of Legends or Counter-Strike esports recently. We had Max and Will on a couple weeks ago talking about strategy there. So definitely recommend going and checking that out. But he also asked another question about our sliders. And I had mentioned on stream yesterday, talking about the back testing we do of our sliders. And I was making a broader point about correlation theory in DFS and why we correlate and how much we have to correlate. And I made the statement that because our sliders are back tested against data, we can actually use them to check our intuitive knowledge about how certain DFS strategy works, right? Correlation comes down when you place bigger slates. That's kind of an intuitive discussion that we had yesterday, and then we can check that against the sliders because they're back tested by data. And Jacko asked, how frequently are the sliders updated based on recent back testing? And that's a great follow-up question to that. The answer is we are pretty consistently retesting these throughout the season of any major sport. In particular, I think obviously at the start of a new season, we want to make sure that we are fitting the sliders well to the sport. But we will continue to check on this throughout the season. I think some folks even just 2 weeks ago asked in office hours, we made a slight adjustment to some of our sliders in certain contest sizes. And we got a couple questions in office hours about why did the sliders change? And that is exactly what happened. We did some additional testing of the optimal sliders by expected value for certain contest sizes and discovered that I think it was slate sizes and discovered that there was a little bit more edge to be squeezed out of those default sliders. So we pumped them up a little bit. Also, if we make a change overall to the model or something that we may think might have an overall effect, we will double check and retest those and make sure that they are in the right spots. We did, I think the change I'm referring to that took place a couple weeks ago was mostly around ownership. And I think Matt had made an announcement in the baseball channels, but we had made some improvements overall to the way we're handling ownership fade. And then that resulted in some minor tweaks overall to the way our default sliders were set after we tested the improvements to the model. So long story short, it's something that we're kind of watching and keeping an eye on all the time throughout the season of any of our sports. We in particular are careful about retesting and making adjustments to the default sliders when we make changes to the model or the ownership model or anything like that. So cool. Great question. I'm going to keep us moving along here. Let me think about the best question to pick out here next. I'm gonna move over here to this. This is from Shiver Me Ginger. This is just chronological order here. And if you missed it, we spent quite a bit of time. Well, we spent about the last 10 minutes of the show yesterday talking about leverage. We had a question come in just asking, what is leverage? One of my favorite DFS concepts to talk about. So I was a little bit jammed for time. I tried to pack as much as I could into the last 10 minutes, and it sounds like it was helpful for you guys. But Shiver Me Ginger wanted me to expand on this a little bit today, and he asked this question. In office hours, you talked about the leverage section as an example of, say, 9-game slates, 5 stacks win 20% of the time. I've seen RG have slate IQ stuff on the past on this. What would be the best way to go and analyze this type of stuff, if it would even be possible? I've seen in last NFL season where 2-1 or 2-2 stacks have X win percent success and the field has Y, so going over or under provides leverage. Yeah, so this is kind of a summary of how I defined leverage yesterday. If you missed it, I recommend going and checking it out. It is one of the last questions I took on in yesterday's show, so it'll be at kind of the bottom of the timestamp list. But basically what I said is I defined it as the field inefficiently assessing the win percentage of a certain player or lineup or roster construction, which is really what Shiver Me Ginger is getting at here. Basically, I think this is the exact example I used yesterday. Maybe a 5-stack wins 20% of the time on a certain slate, or that's the optimal roster construction, but the field only uses it 10% of the time. There is leverage by going over the field on that particular construction, right? So what I see in this question really is like, okay, great. That's awesome theory. Now, what can I really do with this? And this is actually, kind of an interesting ongoing problem space in DFS, and I think it's a hard problem to solve. It's not exactly hard to solve the question of how much is the field going to do something. I think we handle that pretty well. The question, I think, where it gets very difficult is what is the optimal ownership, or what's the exact amount of time that a certain construction or player or lineup ends up being the optimal one, or the successful one, or the highest EV one. And that's a difficult problem. I think the easiest way to immediately add value to your process when you're thinking about leverage is to do it in a more intuitive way. So let me go ahead and pull up SaberSim here. And just talk about a couple things here. I don't want to. I want to make this as useful, because I know yesterday I stayed a little more theoretical, and I want to make sure we're staying practical here. I think one thing's important to remember is that I mentioned yesterday that blindly fading ownership is not leverage, but by the way our ownership fade slider works, by telling the builder to take into account ownership when we're building lineups, we do naturally get a little bit of the effect of leverage into our builds, right? We're essentially, when we run a build, we're saying, consider the impacts of correlation and the correlation coefficients between players. Look at the real ranges of outcomes of players based on their sims and their smart diversity, and consider the ownership and give me the best, highest EV lineups possible, right? So there are a lot of different players that are going to be highly owned on any given slate, but the use of the ownership fade slider here is going to basically force the builder to make tough decisions about where the ownership is best. So I think we get a lot of this out of the box already. I think this is an opportunity to add a little bit of additional value. And I think one way you can do that here, when we're talking about leverage, let me just run a test build here, is to continue, one of the trends I talked about yesterday is looking at this from the standpoint of what is the fail condition of a popular play, right? We often think about what is the success condition of a certain lineup construction, right? And that comes into play with stacking, right? Like, what is the success condition of a lineup that you have a 5 stack, right, of a certain team? Well, it's that entire team hitting a ceiling outcome, and it's correlated, and that builds on itself. And there's a bit of a story that's told there, right? When this team scores 12 runs, I have 5 pieces from that team. But I don't think we always consider the negative condition. And I'll show you kind of what I mean. So let's go ahead and look at our pitchers here. We just ran a test build of 20 lineups. And I'm going to say show all players. I want to see every player in the pool. And I want to look at maybe some highly owned pitchers that maybe we're underweight on, right? So we are underweight on Kevin Gausman here. I'm going to, and he's expected to be the second chalkiest pitcher on the slate. We are overweight on Brandon Woodruff, right? This is kind of what I mean by the builders going to naturally lead you to some leverage opportunities out of the gate, right? We are forcing the builder to make decisions about highly owned pitchers, and it is overweight on Brandon Woodruff, implying that maybe the field is undervaluing him even as the highest projected owned pitcher on the slate. And we're underweight on most of these next few guys, right? You can see kind of the statement unfolding here. The field is improperly assuming that the top 5 or so pitchers on the slate are all close in value, and our model believes that Woodruff is far and away the best option, and it correlates with what we see in the projections. It makes a lot of sense, right? But let's go ahead and look at this here. If the implication is that the field is overvaluing Kevin Gausman and we are coming in underweight, one way we can do this here is, let's just cross him off completely here for the purposes of example, is what's the fail condition for Kevin Gausman, right, when we fade him? Maybe it's that he's just not one of the top 2 pitchers, but maybe it's that he gets lit up by the Dodgers, right? It's a good hitting team already. If the field is overweighting Gausman, it is likely that they are also underweighting the Dodgers. One thing we can do here, and the builder may already do it, okay, so it hasn't, is then give ourselves some access to the team that stands to gain the most when Gausman fails, and that's the Dodgers. So we can do that by pulling up our batters. We're still showing all players. Sort by team. Go find some Dodgers bats. So we do have one lineup with Will Smith. Maybe what we go ahead and do is say that we want 20% of our lineups to have Dodger stacks. So let's go ahead and add 20%. Maybe let's do 20% Mookie and see what happens. It might not like that much. Yeah, it doesn't have enough lineups built that way already. Let's see if I can add just a few of these guys. Surely we don't even have any Dodger stacks. So I don't have enough lineups for this, unfortunately. Let's see if I can just bump up some Will Smith maybe and just start seeing if I can get some stacks here. Yeah, it really didn't want to build any Dodger stacks for me. So maybe this didn't end up being the best example. But the point I'm making here is that we can make, okay, now we might have some Dodger stacks. Yes, we do. Okay, so now let's say we want 20% total Dodger stacks. And let's get rid of our exposure limits on the actual individual players. So that it can just build us whatever ones it wants. Okay, it doesn't even have that many Dodger stacks in the lineup. I guess my point here is that the original question came through of like, how is the best way to use this definition of leverage and analyze it? And I think you can get very hung up on trying to come up with calculations. There's a way to do this, right? There's a classic like 4for4 article that was written a few years ago about calculating leverage scores. And I think you can kind of get hung up, at least for the way I think about this, on going through and doing a very analytical approach to leverage, and instead being aware of the definition and what it means, right? It's about market efficiencies of the way the field is assessing the best plays, and it's about taking advantage of what the conditions for success and the conditions for failure of certain players are. We can use this to be kind of intuitive about our approach on a slate, right? And this would be one way to do it. In this example, the builder clearly really doesn't want to use Dodgers. So if I wanted to get some Dodgers, maybe what I would need to go is go back and bump up their team projection a bit, or add a manual stacking rule to force some of them into my lineups. Either of those would work with the condition that I had already decided to fade Gausman, right? That's the fail condition there. So I noted you mentioned the slate IQ stuff. I've seen some of that too. I think the one thing you need to be very careful of there is there are similarities in certain slates, right? Obviously, we use default sliders, and when we say these are our default sliders for 15-game slates, we are making a general assumption that 15-game slates are similar enough that we can do that, right? And I think that mostly works. The one thing to be careful of with these, anytime someone's giving you actual like leverage values of a certain player or stack or team, it's important to know where that number is coming from. And you have to be careful with the problem of sample size, right? I know that Slate IQ article in particular, I think it's an interesting one. It's using what is described as the 25 most similar past slates. And that is a difficult thing to assess, right? How I think I find it hard to know. Every slate is kind of its own puzzle in its own unique way. And while one slate may bear similarities to another, and you may be able to learn something about maybe the way the field interacts with 15-game slates, I don't know if you can use 25 previous slates and come up with a judgment call about where you might find leverage on the current slate. That's just me personally, but yeah, anyway, I think this has been an interesting discussion we've kind of been having on and off the last couple days. If anyone has any questions about that, let me know. I'm happy to continue talking about this. I find leverage really interesting. I think on a slate-to-slate basis, we can continue to talk about different ways you can find it. I think there's probably maybe a budding strategy session here at some point talking about this a little more. If you've been sitting here listening to me talk for the last 10 minutes and you have no idea what I'm talking about at all, I'd recommend going back and checking out yesterday's kind of final segment where I talked a little bit about leverage. I defined these things a little bit more from the beginning here. That will probably help to catch you up. So yeah, I guess in summary, I think we can use that definition of leverage that we now know and recognize, one, that the ownership fade slider is going to help us get some of the way there because we force it to make decisions about where the field is well assessing value and where it isn't. But from there, we can make minor adjustments in our projections or our exposures to emphasize plays that provide us relative edge over the field because they're taking advantage of market inefficiencies. Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to keep rolling. Again, if you have any questions, any of that was confusing, let me know. And I'll keep us moving along here. So, let's see. CLE asked a question here. This came in earlier this morning. And the question is, in the golf strategy session the other week, Max talked about ways to cull the player pool. Any similar things that can be used for very large MLB slates like tonight's? It's a great question. This question refers to our PGA DFS strategy session we did for the US Open a couple weeks ago. That's also up on YouTube if you've been playing golf. Wasn't just our favorite picks or anything like that for the US Open, right? It was a deep dive strategy into overall golf DFS strategy. So if you play golf, I highly recommend checking it out. And we did mention in that particular video that managing your player pool for golf can be very important, a very necessary part of your process, because there are players in the golf pool every single week and every single tournament with pretty spectacular downside, with a low overall chance to make the cut, and then from there, a very low overall chance to top 20 or something like that. I guess I don't really need this up. And we mentioned that it was just an important part of the process to avoid having those players in your pool at all, in particular to avoid having lineups where you have 2 or 3 or more of those players. That effect compounds on itself, and you have lineups with very low upside and very significant downside. So with that said, I don't necessarily think that effect exists as much in baseball. I think I've mentioned this before, that the biggest factor in determining the size of your player pool is going to be the smart diversity slider, which is set at a level that we think is appropriate for the certain contest size and the slate we're on, right? And you'll actually see that on a slate like a 15-game slate like today, on most of our contest sizes, the smart diversity slider is going to come down a little bit for exactly what this question is getting at, right? There's so many players in a pool. There's so many players to just click on for DFS players that we can get a little bit closer to mean projections in the form of smart diversity coming down. We can tighten our player pool up a little bit and basically take advantage of our projections, our mean projections being accurate, because a lot of other players playing are just going to play poorer plays, right? Ownership is going to get a little bit more spread out as well here too. So let's run a build here. Actually, I already have my build. Let's go back to the build. So that smart diversity setting set at its default value is going to give you basically a player pool that we feel, I'm going to reset exposure settings here, is generally appropriate for the contest. And you can see here we have access to 12 or so pitchers, fairly spread out at pitching. The reason being because we're extremely concentrated at our stacks, right? We're playing a ton of Royals or Red Sox. And you'll kind of see this general trend pretty often if you are using SaberSim to build your baseball lineups, right? You will see that it kind of establishes a sense of a core for you within your pitchers or maybe within a certain stack right out of the gate, right? I know there was a question yesterday about using core plays. This is kind of what I was referring to when I answered that question about, we're going to have the builder is going to, we don't give core plays in the form of content because the builder is going to often kind of push you in the direction where it feels like the core plays are, which clearly is in the Royals and Red Sox stacks. But from here, I think it kind of then ends up being a decision about your overall risk aversion and your upside versus risk that you personally want to take on for the slate, right? This may be too risky for certain players, and you want to trim this down and get a little bit more access to other stacks, maybe no more than, oh, that's not what I meant to do, but that's fine. Maybe you want to trim this down a little bit, right? And that's a little bit too risky of a stance for you to start. Or maybe this is too spread out of a pitching pool for you, and you want to cull some of these guys off the bottom and tighten up your player pool. There's nothing wrong with either of these approaches as a means of managing your player pool, figuring out what your total lineup portfolio looks like. But I don't think baseball has the same overall effect of that need to maybe cull some players off the bottom prior to a build in the same way we do in golf. There's not really... I think part of the issue too, or not the issue, but part of the reason this does come up in golf is that projections are often a little bit more condensed. You can actually get some of these players that are like min salary with a very low chance to make the cut because they grade out on a point per dollar basis pretty well. Whereas in baseball, those guys just even like I could come up here and say that, you know, okay, you should cut off, you should not play stacks of teams that are projected for under 4 runs. That's probably not even true, but we don't need to do that because we're also just not going to get very many of those teams to begin with. So you can still manage your player pool. The smart diversity slider is going to get you in a good spot right out of the gate with the appropriate level of players in your player pool and your exposure to some of these players. I don't think you need to do a lot of management beforehand to cull the player pool prior to building. But hopefully that was helpful. Let me know if you still have questions on that. Happy to talk about that a little bit more. I know there was a follow-up question to this that came up here also about percentiles. It says, also when looking at 85th percentile lineups, do you build with the average and then filter by percentile, or do you build at the 85th percentile? This came up also a couple days ago here. I know I see Jack linked over our FAQ on percentile. So there is some useful information in there. I definitely recommend checking that out. The answer to this question here, really, there's not going to be a significant difference into your overall lineup construction between these two options. What is going to happen here is if we select 85th percentile, right, and then build, we are going to build a set of lineups. Our 500 pool of lineups or something like that for a 20 max build are all going to use 85th percentile projections within them. It is going to slightly increase the exposure to plays that maybe have a little bit higher ceiling at the expense of average performance, right? Players that maybe have a disproportionately higher 85th percentile than their mean outcome would indicate may float to a little bit higher in your overall exposures. If instead you run this at average and then in the post-build process, change your percentile to 85th. Give this a second here. So you can do this up here, right? You can, after the build, you can change your percentile to 85th. It's then going to update all the players' projections as if you had done so manually in the post-build process, and therefore maybe will emphasize bubbling up the 20 best lineups to the top from your pool of 500 that were built at the average projection, right? So you can see, I think neither of these is going to have a significant difference between each other. I think either is fine. You maybe will slightly emphasize having a little bit higher upside lineups at the expense of average performance, doing it before the build, but the effect of that is going to be very minor, almost unnoticeable. And if you're comparing between two builds, the impact of a smart diversity slider affecting the overall exposures to a player. So for example, if you run both of these things side by side and then compare and say, oh, I got 35% Brandon Woodruff doing it one way and 50% the other way, it is likely that you are actually just seeing the impacts of the smart diversity slider itself create natural variance between your builds rather than actually seeing any scientific difference between those two methods. Either's fine. They will both have the effect of emphasizing ceiling a little bit more in your lineup construction. So let me know if that helps, if there's any follow-up questions there. I don't see any other questions have come in recently here in Slack. I see we did get one question right out of the gate from Solid Picks here in YouTube. And he asked, is a 4x4 stack the most optimal for FanDuel players? I'm trying to understand stacking. Cool. Yeah, I don't talk about FanDuel enough here. I should come in here and maybe one day just stay on the FanDuel side of our app the whole time. This is a similar question we got yesterday, right? We had a question that yesterday on the DraftKings side that said something to the effect of, is a 4 or a 5 stack better? So Solid Picks, I don't know if you were with us yesterday here in the show. I maybe would recommend going and checking that section out from yesterday's show as well. I think it will help to kind of support this conversation. But I'll talk about this a little bit now too. And let's just run a FanDuel build. This is fun. I honestly haven't run a lot of FanDuel builds here on the show here. So let's kind of see what we're getting out of this. And let's just look at what our stacks look like, right? We're gonna do the hypothetical 20 max between 10K and 50K here. And just kind of see what we get out of this. We'll talk a little bit about this. So just give this a second here. Let me catch my breath anyway. Seems like maybe we got a little seems like maybe we didn't get the whole pool built, or it needed a little more time. I'm just going to cut it off there. Let's talk about what we're seeing here, right? So we do see a fair bit of 4-4 stacks, and we've also got some 4-3s mixed in there, and some 4-2s, and a 4-2-2, and a 3-3, right? And you can see our highest leverage, or our highest, excuse me, I've been saying leverage too much. Our highest Saber score lineup is just a 4-3. We've got 4-2s coming in here. We hit our first 4-4. Is our 10th best lineup with a Saber score of 96.5. What the builder is indicating to us is that taking out our settings for correlation, which controls stacking, for ownership, and smart diversity, which allows us to get upside players in our lineups, there's a variety of viable stacking options on the slate. And we may have a 4-3 stack lineup that outscores a 4-4 stack lineup, maybe because this lineup better takes into account the impacts of ownership or has higher upside plays in the lineup. So what is conventional around the industry now, I feel like, is this idea that you have to make the biggest stack possible, especially on the biggest slates like tonight. And on a bigger slate like tonight, I think we are going to be, in general, pushed in the direction of stacking more aggressively. Our correlation slider is higher than it was yesterday, right? Again, for the same reasons we talked about yesterday, when there are this many plays on the slate, there are so many players in the player pool, it is unlikely that the winning lineups at the top of the contests approach the mathematical optimal lineups of a contest. So we can rely on the tool of correlation, right? Correlation is a tool. Stacking is a tool that allows us to win at DFS because it means that the win condition of a lineup is in sync with each other, right? Like Michael Chavis's win condition, right? The situation where he is an optimal play is in sync, is correlated with the conditions where Devers and Renfroe and Bogarts are optimal plays, right? That is a tool that does not necessarily mean that these players are all going to be mathematically optimal on the same night. It just means that they are likelier to score better with each other. So when there are this many games on a slate, there are 15 games on a slate, we can rely on the tool of correlation more because DFS players aren't going to find that optimal as readily. There's too many players on the slate. So with all that said, I wouldn't say 4-4 stacks or 5-3 stacks on DraftKings are ever most optimal, the only way to play, the best way to play. I think you can find leverage on the field because DFS players are still not stacking enough for how often these roster constructions win. but I do not think you need to force these stacks into your lineups, to be completely honest. I think even if we have this 3-3 lineup trickle in, it's our 11th best lineup. It has a Saber score of 96-1. There's something, maybe it is a roster construction that people are unlikely to go to. I'm just like looking at this here right now. I mean, we have two extremely low-owned one-offs that are not correlated with anyone else in the lineup, but they're min-priced, extremely high-value plays in probably good run environments that maybe is giving this lineup a higher Saber score, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with crossing this off and saying, I just want to play the highest correlated lineups. But I push back on the idea that a certain heuristic or a rule of thumb about stacking is what must be used to be successful in DFS. And I think what is so cool about SaberSim's builder is that it's taking this into account dynamically on a slate-to-slate basis, looking at ownership and looking at these real ranges of outcomes of players to give you lineups that make sense that are also still correlated, right? There's slates where the best plays on the pitching side are very expensive aces, and the best plays on the hitting side are very expensive stacks, big full 5 stacks. And maybe the optimal way to play that slate is to get more spread out in your stacks, and rather than jamming in 5-piece stacks of poorly projected plays just to say you did, maybe the better way to build is to use smaller piece stacks like 3 and 4-piece stacks, for example, of those really high projected expensive bats, and build lineups that way while still getting the expensive aces up top, right? It's just an example off the top of my head here. A heuristic like always stack 5-3 on DraftKings and always stack 4-4 on FanDuel leaves no room for flexibility. Flexibility and slate context is really one of the names of the game here playing DFS. So I think I maybe leave that question there. I go a little bit deeper in yesterday's video into like correlation theory, why we're correlating. I touched on it here a little bit today, but like why we're correlating lineups, what stacking actually does for us. So if you missed that, I think that's helpful to see this. Otherwise, in summary here, I don't like to force stacks. I think it doesn't allow for that slate context. I would let the builder do what it wants. And then from there, it's perfectly fine to dial things in if you would like to maybe remove some of the smaller piece stacks off the bottom. I know I haven't played FanDuel in some time, but I know a lot of people like to do things like this, where they either do 4-3 with one one-off or 4-4 with one one-off. These are obviously still viable lineups. They're in our pool, but I don't think you need to feel like you have to do this. So I think, and last line on this, I know I have a tendency to stay on these topics for a long time. I don't see any other questions that have come in, so maybe that is just okay. The last thing I'll note on this is, and I think I mentioned this a little bit last week, is the rules about these stacks about, it's the right way to do it is to always stack 4-4 lineups or 4-3s or 5-3s on DraftKings or 5 stacks, comes from the fact that most optimizers on the market can't do what SaberSim does. They're just, there aren't other optimizers where you can say, okay, it's a 15-game slate. We're playing on DraftKings. We're playing baseball. I want to take into account the effects of correlation between players at a very high level while also taking into account these things and build lineups that make sense. That's not how other optimizers work. Other optimizers, you have to go in and you manually set yourself a rule based on a rule of thumb of something to be true. Okay, correlation is a tool that helps me build effective lineups, so I'm just going to make it build me lineups that have 5 players from one team in it, right? And that's how this thing gets started, right? The idea that you hear that you need a 5 stack on DraftKings when you're playing baseball is because most optimizers, that's as far as it can go. That's as sophisticated as it can get. Don't build me a lineup that has any less than 5 of one player in it. But we can say, build me lineups that take into account the effects of correlation, the effects of ownership, and take into account players' real ranges of outcomes in the form of smart diversity, and build me winning lineups. And then at that point, we don't have to subscribe to this idea that the only winning lineups are lineups that have 4-3 or above on FanDuel, because we have the tools with SaberSim to build winning lineups that, even maybe if they have a smaller stack, are still appropriately leveraged for the contest against ownership, and are still constructed in a way that creates upside and still have some level of correlation and things like that. So don't let rules of thumb that exist to help players set lineups on optimizers that can't do what SaberSim does, to be completely honest, cloud your judgment of the way to build winning SaberSim lineups. I think that is a very important takeaway here from this. So cool. So stayed on that for a long time. I did see this second question here, solid picks from your question, if I'm trying to understand stacking. I think if I would be happy to kind of start from a much earlier point here too, and review some kind of like principles of why we stack in baseball, if that would be helpful to you. I'd be happy to talk about that too. So I'm gonna kind of move along here for now, but if that would be helpful for you, just let me know, or anybody. But yeah, and then Don mentioned, I've been keeping track of the perfect lineups, and many of them in the large slates are smaller than 4-4 and 4-3. And yeah, Don, that's exactly kind of like the point I've been making here over the past couple days, right? There is a difference between the mathematically optimal lineup for any slate and the GPP winning lineup for maybe a contest on that slate. And the closer those two things are, or the closer we might expect them to be, the more we need to build lineups in a way that allows us to find or seek that optimal. And that is reflected in our sliders, right? If we are looking for a mathematically optimal, literally the highest amount of points you can build into a DFS lineup, right? We need to do that on smaller slates, right? And we need to do that more for bigger contests, right? The less players that are in the pool, the easier it is to find the optimal lineup. And the more players that get to make lineups, the easier it is to find that optimal lineup. And that is why you will see typically for smaller slates and for bigger contests, the effects of correlation come down, because you're right. The mathematical optimal of a lot of baseball slates are not 4-4s or 4-3s. On a 15-game baseball slate tonight, there's enough players playing baseball that it's probably not going to be a nice, clean 4-4 stack that is the mathematical optimal. But because there's so many players in the pool and playing a contest size of a relatively moderate amount of players, we can use stacking to beat the contest. But on smaller slates and bigger contests, correlation is going to go down. Smart diversity is probably going to go up, right? We need to look at single game samples and try to find optimals of a singular game outcome across every game, and that's consistent across all of our sports and all of our different slate sizes and default sliders, right? It fits that. The less games on a slate, the closer the GPP winning score is going to be to the mathematical optimal, and the more players in the contest, right? That's another thing. I know a lot of times users will look at, or just DFS players, right? Will look at the highest scoring win in the mini max or something like that. I think the $1 mini max on DraftKings tonight is the biggest contest they are hosting for baseball across the whole site. It's 41,500 entries, right? And the big 50K up top GPP will probably have like 15,000 to 25,000. The winning score in the minimax is probably going to be higher than the winning score in the $15 or $18 50K to first contest, right? It's going to be closer to whatever the actual mathematical optimal was on the slate that night, because there's way more players in the pool. It doesn't necessarily mean that those players playing down in the minimax are better. It means that there's more of them and they approach the optimal better. So always very important to remember that, right? We're playing a game where the goal is to beat all the other players in the contest. And we can use, and that creates tools that otherwise would not exist, right? If all we were trying to do was find the optimal, in any given slate. I'm talking on this, by the way. I'll interrupt myself. I'm talking on this because I haven't seen a question come in, and I find it kind of interesting. So I'm going to continue going here. If you have a question, I will drop this immediately, and we'll move on because I'm going to kind of just keep going here because I'm on a tear a little bit with this, right? We're trying to beat other players in the contest. We're not trying to find the optimal. If we were trying to find the optimal, if the game was find the optimal lineup, we wouldn't even care about ownership. First of all, that would be just thrown out of the window. We probably would not very much care about the impacts of correlation. Maybe not even at all. Maybe if we were just optimal searching, our sliders would look something like this, right? We're looking for that one. We're looking for like just a set of optimal lineups where we simulate the game, every game one time each, and get these optimal lineups that come out. Let's just run this. Let's see what it looks like. So we're on DK now. I switched back over. Couldn't help myself. So let's just see what these look like. Right? We'll get these lineups. They're going to look quite a bit different than what we build for DFS contests, where we're trying to be the best DFS player in the contest and not search for optimals. Give this a second to build. We don't even need the whole thing. It'll be pretty clear right off the bat what kind of lineups we're getting. And I probably should have done this yesterday, but Prize Pick says keep going. Or Solid Pick says keep going. I will just keep tearing away here for our last 15 minutes or so. But give this a second here. All right, so we've got 500. I probably only needed 20, but come on. All right. Let's see. Let's adjust 2 projections so that we can get this message to go away, right? So this is we built lineups as if we were searching for the optimal. And look how different these look, right? Like, yeah, we're going to still get stacks because real correlation actually exists, right? Like there are players hitting really well. We even have a 4 stack in here, right? Like some condition where, what team is it? Philly just goes off, right? And like Segura going off allows Bohm and Herrera and Real Muto more at bats. Like real correlation does actually exist between these players. But you can see in the hunt for the optimal, these lineups look totally different than what we get on the slate tonight. And that's because it's a 15-game slate where players are going to struggle to find that optimal, and the winning score is going to be far away from it. So we can rely heavily on the tools like correlation and like ownership fade to allow us to build lineups that win the contest. Now compare this to like a 2-game slate, right? So the night slate, not a true proper 2-game. Well, it is a 2-game slate, but it's not like a 2-game main slate. The difference, right? You can see that our correlation comes down a little bit, right? Comes down quite a bit. And we're going to build lineups that a bit more approach the optimal. Ownership fade is actually going to go up on our smaller slates. And that comes from the fact that ownership condenses onto plays that aren't like maybe relative to a larger slate, very good plays. They're just relatively the best point per dollar plays on the slate. So we are willing to fade more ownership on smaller slates. Anyway, this is a bit of a tangent. My point is smaller slates, bigger contests. We have to smaller slates, bigger contests. The lineups in the entries in that contest are going to approach the optimal. So we need to play in ways that allow us to find the optimal easier. Bigger slates, smaller contests, the winning score is going to not approach the optimal. It's going to be further away from the optimal. So our focus ends up being more on building lineups that win the contest by using tools like correlation and stacking and things like that. So let's see. Okay, cool. So I did see another question trickle in here now from Josh here on YouTube. I pretty much only play 20 max contests, but I want to get a little more into the cash game side of things. Any cash game specific advice by chance? Josh, this came up a couple weeks ago here where I had a lot of time to talk about cash game strategy. It's on our YouTube channel. I think the video says like DFS Office Hours. It has the date, and then it says like cash game basics. It was just a couple weeks ago. I had more time in that video to dive into cash games a little bit more. I'd recommend checking that out. I would start, first of all, by saying, if you are playing 20 max GPPs and you are interested in getting more into cash, as you've kind of described, I would maybe urge you to not. Like, our position overall here is that the edge in cash games is very thin. It's very small. I think it requires a very large bankroll to realize that edge, and you've really got to grind it out. It is not a part of our, we have this, I've posted this a few times now here. We have this guide to building a MLB DFS process on our site under, I went really fast there. I went under resources, strategy, baseball, course. And it starts with bankroll management and contest selection. So Andy hops on in this video and actually walks through the DraftKings lobby and talks about the best contests to play to build out a bankroll. And this doesn't even need to be necessarily directed at a beginner, right? This is useful for everybody. I found this video very useful. There are no cash games in this video. I think there is a lot of really high quality tournament contests that you can play before it really makes sense to add in cash games, because the edge is so small. And I think it takes a really big amount of volume of cash games to realize it. Even extremely successful professional DFS players, right? If you look at their ROI and their returns on tournament play versus cash games, a lot of times in cash, you are really kind of grinding out a 5% or so ROI if you are extremely skilled at cash games, which just doesn't translate to a ton unless you're playing a ton of volume. They're difficult contests to win, partly because it's very easy to find a decent set of projections and build a mean projected optimal lineup with any run-of-the-mill optimizer out there, right? Those tools are very readily available. There's more to it in cash games than just that. There's some game theory stuff that comes into a play. Yeah, you said, I saw this question come in, or I saw this note. I did well in CSGO cash games because it's more niche. Got handed to me in NFL, NBA, MLB cash. Yeah, I can totally see that. Counter-Strike projections, good ones, are not very easy to find. We have great ones. Will was on here a couple weeks ago talking about how the work he's put into our Counter-Strike Go model. We didn't talk a lot about cash games in that video. I don't know if Will plays cash or recommends that. Will, maybe if you're watching, curious what your thoughts are about somebody maybe using the projections to build cash lineups or any cash game strategies overall. But we do have a very good Counter-Strike model, and there's not a lot of good Counter-Strike projections out there. So it does not surprise me that you were able to find an edge in that. So I think that's interesting. NFL, NBA, MLB, as you referenced here, are going to be pretty sharp. I think there's a little bit of edge in NFL cash because there's so many soft players that play only football and set lineups from the couch and maybe aren't even using projections and things like that. I think all three of those sports have an effect at maybe the start of the season, that there's a influx of softer players that just join in to play around a little bit at the start of the season. But like by the halfway point after the All-Star break in either NBA or MLB, cash games are just going to get so sharp. They really do. And I mentioned this the last time I talked about cash. 90% of your cash game strategy is ultimately going to revolve around finding soft opponents in the form of head-to-heads or just soft contests overall. 10% of it, maybe 5% of it, is going to be building the lineup, because it really, with a couple other notes about maybe emphasizing higher owned plays from a game theory standpoint, it's really mostly about just generating the optimal and finding weak opponents. But I did have a little bit more time last time this came up to dive deep into cash game strategy. I think I spent 20, 30 minutes or so on it. There are some things to talk about there. That video is in our library on YouTube. If you're interested in trying some cash out, I would go check that video out. Being completely upfront, I don't play any cash games. I know we do have some folks on the SaberSim team that do, and they're successful with it. And again, I think you can grind out that ROI over a long period of time. But the edge and the money, I think, is really in the GPPs. So Yeah. Josh said, thank you. No problem. Not a problem at all. Got plenty of time to chat here. Don't see any other questions have come in again yet. So got 5 minutes or so left here. Anyone else have any questions for me or anything that you want to talk about today? It always goes so fast. Let's see. Josh said for 150 max contests, I noticed Squid only has 50 lines. Is that a rule of thumb or just a decision made for today? I don't know. I think what is probably the answer to that question is that he feels there are 50 profitable lineups to be made for the contest. A lot of that has to do with payout structures, right? As payout structures continue to get more and more top heavy, which they are, enormous amount of the prizes are now going to first. It is to the benefit of very sharp players, especially those with a lot of bankroll to commit, to play less lineups into the contest, right? They're less, if all the money's up at first, or 35% of the money's up at first, or 45% of the money's up at first, it may not make sense to 150 max that contest, because in some ways you compete against yourself for that one singular top prize. That is at the top. It may be that he feels there's only 50 or so profitable lineups that he wants to make for that contest tonight. Again, top heavy contests, those big GPPs at the top have a thinner line of profitability, right? The more, I guess, let me put it this way. The flatter a payout structure is on a contest, in theory, the more profitable lineups you can make for that contest, because there's just more money paid out to lower pay ranges, right? You don't need to only build lineups that have top 10 equity. You can be profitable building lineups that have top 1% or top 5% equity in the contest. And therefore you can make you have a much wider range of lineups that you can make that are profitable. So Squid's extremely smart. Obviously, I would assume that the answer to that question is that he feels that there are 50 profitable lineups that he can make to enter into that contest. So but I don't know. I don't know. So let's see what I know some people will fill the 150, but with duped lineups. So if they hit, they get more money, but seems risky since you give up variation. It is almost, I actually think it is 100% of the time negative EV to dupe yourself, right? You immediately drop the, right? You are playing twice to win less, right? If you enter two lineups into the same contest and say it's $10 to first and $5 to second, it's a super small contest, right? Let's say if you only enter one and that lineup has some win equity for first place, it can theoretically win first place. The upside of that lineup is $10, right? By duplicating it, you immediately drop the upside of that lineup to $7.50, right? That's the total upside there. The last thing we want to do when we're playing DFS is be duped by anyone else. Actually, no, the second to last thing we want to do in DFS is be duped by anybody else in a contest, because it lowers our EV of that lineup. The first thing we never want to do in DFS is duplicate ourselves. So I would say you're probably unlikely to ever see any sharp players duplicate themselves in a contest unless something went wrong and maybe their CSV import failed or they ran out of time or something like that. Now you can use the same lineup in multiple different contests because the payout structures are independent. But you never want to dupe yourself in your own contest. I would definitely say anybody that you see that's a sharper player that does that probably did so accidentally. But all right, cool. I think that's about it. It's been another great day here on Office Hours. Thank you, everybody that has continued to make this possible by asking questions and continuing the conversation in Slack after the show. It's been a lot of fun here. I will be right back at this again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, same time, same place. So feel free to pop questions into Slack in the meantime. If you're setting lineups tonight, right, locks coming up here in whatever it is, 4 hours. You're setting lineups. You have a question then. Feel free to pop it into Office Hours Slack as soon as you think of it, and I'll get to it first thing on the show tomorrow. Otherwise, if you want to email instead, support@sabersim.com. Let me know you want your question answered on stream. We'll take it on live here on the show. I'm excited to play this big 15 gamer tonight. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We'll be right back at it again with Office Hours tomorrow, maybe to talk about it and review or whatever you guys want. And then, of course, strategy session on Thursday. Me and Max talking a little bit of bigger picture lineup building strategies for baseball. So excited for everything we got going on this week. Again, enjoy the slate tonight, and I'll talk to you guys all tomorrow. See ya.